All right, let's see. Mic is on, I have the clicker. We can start. So my presentation is about multilingual SEO, search engine optimization, and transcreation. These are two ways of doing multilingual content, of course, and I will try to give you some practical tips and tricks around these topics. Because, of course, we all want to do our content marketing. We want to do it in different languages. We have already talked about why you want to do that. And of course, coming back to what Jani said in his presentation, what we really want to do is to help our customers remove the friction, make their lives as easy as possible. But we need to be able to do that in more languages than one. We need to be able to do that in more cultures than one, because language always goes with a culture, and with culture go then also the different connotations, the different meanings, different ways of doing things, different expectations. So even if, of course, Amazon and Google are dominating our world these days, Amazon and Google look a bit different. They are looked at a bit from different perspectives in China, in the Nordics, in America. So what you want to do ultimately is to talk to your customers not only in their language, but also in a way that will then eventually result in the reactions that you actually want to have, in more buying, basically, because that's what marketing is about. Sometimes it goes a bit wrong. This is a campaign that CocaCola, a global brand that you would perhaps expect more from, did in New Zealand recently, got some publicity for it. They put this text on the vending machines where you can buy your drink in New Zealand, and of course, basically what they did was perfectly right, the correct thing to do. They went for a localized version of talking to their audiences. Kia ora is Maori language, so the native language of New Zealand. And mate, obviously, is English, also very much used in New Zealand and Australia, much more than in Britain, for instance. So they wanted to have the local touch, speak to their audience in the way they would speak to each other. But what went wrong here is that mate also is mate, also a word in Maori language, and it means death. So what they were actually telling to their customers was, hello, death. Maybe not really the intended effect, I would assume. So the point here is not that don't translate, don't localize. The point is that localize so deeply that you actually know what you're doing. Another example, which is a good one. Glennon already talked a lot about why you need to be able to support your translators or your local teams for creating your content in language versions quite a lot. And the way IKEA does it is that when they are publishing their catalog, their product catalog, which in a sense is to them very important for their brand, the sense of what they are doing, of course online, in printing, all the channels. They invite their local teams, their translation teams from all around the world to Sweden for several days, and then they do a briefing, a workshop with all the people about what is essential in our new product catalog, what we are aiming with it, what are our key messages, what are the brand guidelines that we want you to keep in mind when you're doing the language versions. And only after that does the catalog get localized. Coming back to that later on. So, when you're doing multilingual content marketing, there are a few things you might want to consider already beforehand, before anything gets even written in the master language or created as master content. One of these things is your team. The typical ways of doing this are you might want to have a translation agency, marketing agency helping you, or you might have an internal team that might be spread all around the world in different countries. All of these setups may work. There are different reasons why you might want to choose one of them. But the important thing to understand is that you need to build up a team. So if you have a translation agency, if you have a marketing agency, or even if you have your own people, you will need to make them feel like members of your marketing team. And they involve them in the process of also creating your master content, because that's the prerequisite for really well-working multilingual content. You might also want to consider your infrastructure, pipeline type of things, systems that you're using. If you don't have very much content, and if you're only doing, let's say, 2 or 3 languages, you might be able to get away with a fairly manual copying and pasting into Word type of approach. But if you have, let's say, 10 plus, 40 plus languages, if you're publishing on social media every day, every hour, then of course you can't do it by copying and pasting anymore. You will need to create more automation in the process, integrate to your own content management systems, make sure that the people who are doing the language versions expect them, are able to start right away when you have something for them, and so on. Planning ahead, also very important, of course. We all need to have schedules. And if you want to have a quick publishing cycle that has been mentioned a couple of times before here, then you also need to be able to tell your team members all around the world, or even in the closest countries to you, what you're expecting of them and when. And you need to have some kind of support system. Glenn showed you his template. You might also want to consider, let's say, more systematic guidance in terms of guiding instructional book of things you want to have in all the content that you publish. You might want to have a checklist for each project, like the template that we showed. You might want to have defined terminology in terms of keywords or brand essential terminology. All that will also help you to remove obstacles from your way in your multilingual content processes. Then I am assuming now that you have learned from what we have told you today or some other sources, and you will have great master content. You have something that works really well. You know that already because you are following your data. You know how well it's performing. Well, that's something that might be useful to share with your local teams as well. You have a team, you have different people doing your multilingual versions. I would advise you to tell them that the multilingual content, the different language versions, are measured against exactly the same KPIs as the source content. So it's not about whether the translations or the language versions are correct or not. It's about whether they get the reactions that we want to get from our customers, whether they are helpful to the customers. And that might mean something else than a pure translation. And of course, what we all are looking for in the end is to lower the cost for customer acquisition, get more revenue per lead, get more sales. And that goes for the language versions as well. Then, when doing multilingual content marketing, also the process of knowing what your customers are searching for, what they actually want to know about your service or products, goes also for the language versions, obviously. You might have a defined keyword list for your master content. You will want to have a defined keyword list for your languages as well. But those keywords might not be the same. It might be a good idea to build a keyword concept around which then you might have a lot of different words that the people might be searching for, a lot of different phrases. And for each of your target markets and languages, it's usually a good idea to do the same kind of trend analysis that you would be doing for your master content. And it doesn't have to be you who is doing it. Glenn told you earlier that it might also be the translators, or it might be a dialogue. Then, one thing also to consider is that there might be differences in the way people are searching for content in different parts of the world. For instance, in some places or in some cultures or in some subgroups of people, people might be looking for more facts. In some other groups, they might be looking for more recommendations, more peer knowledge. Jani told you earlier that basically everybody just trusts their neighbors and friends. That's generally speaking, of course, true. But those peer groups might also be different in different target markets. And you will need to know who are the sources that people are trusting in the countries or in the cultures that you want to reach. That, of course, requires some local knowledge from your team members all around the world. And you might also then want to consider locally well-known partnerships, listings. HoReCa industry is a good example of this. When we're looking for hotels or places to stay at, we don't necessarily even go to Google. We might want to trust listing services like Momondo or hotels.com or things like that. Or they are the ones that come up in the first in the search listings. Technical part of the SEO optimization. Also here, basically, the rule is that you want to do the same things for all your language versions as you're doing for your master version. Technical SEO optimization is more about removing the obstacles, the hindrances from your customer journey than about actually creating anything new. Some things to consider listed here. More structured content is needed all the time. You want to be found in the form of videos, for instance, also in your language versions. So you need to make sure that your content supports that. Sometimes you might want to consider page speed, like let's say you have a great content in English and in the Nordic languages, and it's working well here because we are on 5G and the network speed is really high. But does that really work in China? You might want to know at least how well it works there. Of course, everything needs to work on mobile. Also, the language versions, responsive sites needs to be taken into consideration. Can be also tested by the local teams when you have them. And the last thing is the most important one. Because of the way people are buying and people's behavior is changing and has changed, you want to build your content for interaction. You want to get it shared. You want to get linking. You want to get promotion. You want to get comments and social reactions. And all of that, well, the structure needs to be there, but you can then also very well utilize your local teams in order to actually get that working. And then you will also get more social credibility that Jani was talking about. I've talked a lot so far about what you want to do separately for each of your language versions, things that you need to consider from local perspective, cultural perspective, whether it will work in the same way as for your master language or master content. But then, of course, there are also certain things that you want to keep the same in order to not to lose your brand identity if you have one. And then we come back to the instructions, to the briefing, to the dialogue with your local teams, telling them about what kind of tone of voice is aimed or required from them, what kind of stylistic guidelines there are, whether you want to be more friendly, more informal, whether you want to be more credible, things like that. And of course, if you have key terminology related to your products or services, it's a very good idea usually to define that for all your languages, because otherwise you will very soon end up in a situation in which people are talking about the same things in different ways, and that again then adds friction into the customer's journey, makes it harder to find actually the information that they are looking for. I have a customer case here related to our customer Sats Elixir, a well-known brand in all the Nordic countries. They had a website, of course, in all the Nordic languages, but also in Finnish. And they wanted to boost the performance of that website. It wasn't about a bad translation or the website not working well in other ways. It was about getting more traffic on the website. So what we did with them was that we helped them with the SEO optimization of the Finnish version, and we also then created some local content, some content in Finnish related to the briefing and the instructions and the dialogue with the customer. First step, fairly basic. We got a keyword list from the customer. They had defined the keywords for all the other Nordic languages already, so we had Norwegian, we had Swedish, we had Danish, and we needed to translate those keywords into Finnish first. What we also did was that we gave some alternatives, building around a keyword concept instead of just using a direct translation. Also discussing quite a lot with the customer and their marketing agency what type of keywords are actually used in searches in Finland versus the other Nordic countries. So we did some trend analysis in the background as well, looking at the low-hanging fruits, obviously like low competition, high search rates type of things, but also then, for instance, yearly cycles or other cultural differences in the ways people are searching for information in Finland versus the other Nordic countries. And you might think that there are no differences really, but there are. For instance, that a fact that might be a bit surprising is that the Finns are looking for weight loss related keywords earlier after the summer holidays than the Swedes and the Norwegian people. Why that is, I don't know, but that's what we found out. Maybe we are just more worried about things. Anyway, after you have done your content, you have it in all your languages, you have published it. Important thing to remember is that you don't want to forget about your local teams after that. It might be a good idea to involve them in the sharing, in commenting, in linking the content, and then follow the performance of your content together with them. I started by saying that the KPIs might be the same. It might be a good idea to have the same KPIs. So then after you have something out there, then you want to know whether it's performing well, and if it isn't, it's a good idea to involve also the local teams in the analysis of why it's not performing well, why you're not getting the traffic you wanted to get, and also to try and find the solutions together, because they will bring in the local knowledge and you will bring in the original intent of what you wanted to achieve and how. Moving on to the second part of the presentation about what we call transcreation. It's essentially creative translation, might also be, let's say, translation for a certain purpose or certain usage. And it's a kind of one step further approach compared to the simple optimization of your pages or of your content for the different language versions. So sometimes you might have some content that is really important for you, that you really want to make sure will perform well, but it's also a large piece of content. It's not a blog text or a Twitter comment, it's something bigger. And the way it usually goes is that you put quite a lot of effort into creating the master content, into polishing it, fine-tuning it, making sure it's really great, swelling. And then you send it out for the translation part. The translators do their job, they deliver back. The translation is approved, maybe by local salespeople or something, and it gets published. And then you notice that, okay, this didn't work. You get complaints from your customers. They are telling you that I can't find the information I'm looking for, or this is just horrible translation, or you're not credible in your language versions. And then you end up rewriting maybe yourself or by other people the whole thing. So why not do it in a bit easier way? So let's assume that you have content that you really are putting a lot of effort into, and you want to have it translated, basically because it's too big to be rewritten for each language. Then you might want to highlight some parts in your content and get them transcreated. And what you will get, in a sense then, is a creative translation of those parts. You will also get several alternatives for translation. So the translator will not only provide you with one option, like in Glenn's examples, one big word that you don't understand. They will provide you alternatives. They will also explain to you why they have chosen these alternatives exactly. So commenting rationale about why we thought that this would be a good creative translation for this part of the text or the content that you're having. And you will then also get a back translation to your original language, or let's say your master language. Usually it's English, but might be something else as well, explaining that how the text actually has changed in translation. Because if we're talking about creative approach to translation, then we're moving away from the traditional approach in which the translators want to get it as accurate as possible. We are making changes in the content, and then we need to be able to tell to the customer what actually has changed. This is a very good approach for A/B testing as well. If you want to have, let's say, website content that really answers the people's questions, and you get several versions back from your transcreator team, then you can test those versions with your target audience or with your own people and ask them, is this better in your opinion? I also have an example of this approach. A global logistics company, also a customer of ours, who had an internal transformational program. That's why we're not putting the name up there, because this was about an internal campaign, essentially. But they had a big campaign or program in order to change the way their internal customer care people were doing their job. And they are a global company, so they are operating in more than 50 countries, in more than 50 languages, and they wanted to have their master content translated to these languages so that it would work as well, be as effective, have as much impact in all of those languages, obviously, because they wanted to change the ways people are working. It's never easy, everybody knows that. So they wanted to make sure that at least the material that they were using would be good enough for that. So we did a transcreation project with them. And we started kind of in the IKEA way. We had a workshop with them. They told us who they are talking to, who are their internal customers in this case, might have been also external customers. They talked to us about what the program was all about, what was the total all-round aim or goal of the program, why they were doing it, what they needed to change. They also talked to us about their brand, their company, what they wanted to keep in terms of brand essence. And moreover, target audience, they also talked about the tone of voice, the way they were addressing people. They wanted to get changes happening, so they wanted to be very close to their target audience, their internal people. They didn't want to be too formal, for instance. They didn't want to be telling them what to do. They wanted to involve them in the process. And they had certain terms they wanted to use. For instance, the name of the program was defined. It was decided already beforehand and it wouldn't get translated. There were also some other key terms they wanted to keep from the program content, and they told us about that. In addition, there were also then some parts of the material that had been translated already by their internal people, actually, and that had been approved. So our trans creators got that as a reference. They could learn from it. They could see how these principles, these instructions and guidance had been applied to those parts. And this is what the customer then got from us. There is one example of this material that we were transcreating. As you can see, the English source here, "Hi there, the future of your company is calling. Turn the page to answer," is very much looking for a certain reaction, trying to be as compelling, as impactful as possible. And then we gave the customer, in this case, 3 different alternatives in Finnish, all of them basically saying the same thing, but also with essential differences in the tone, in the way the things are put there. And we try to explain why these choices had been made, what was the difference between the different alternatives. We gave our own recommendation about which one to choose, but in the end, of course, the customer makes the decision. And in this case, they actually didn't go for our recommendation, but the last alternative here, which was, to their ears at least, the most forceful one, the one that called to action in the best possible way. Another example from the German version, also here there was a lot of discussion about the tone of voice that was used, how formally or informally we would talk to the people inside the company. And also in this case, actually the most catchy one of these 3 alternatives, the last one, which is actually the least accurate translation, got then chosen for the final version of this text. This approach of transcreation is not for very large volumes, obviously, because it takes some time to do this kind of analysis, to do this kind of discussion, dialogue, to comment on the translations. So it's a good approach if you have certain highlighted parts of your text or maybe some pages on your website that you really want to make sure are working, but it's not for hundreds of pages, because who would then have the time to read through all the comments and back translations? But something to consider, maybe. That was that from my side. I hope it was helpful, and as the colleagues have said, we are here for your questions.
Thank you, Leena. I have to say it was very, very, very good to hear about the insight into localization.